Spring of 1220, Central Asia. The steppes outside the city of Bukara, shortly after the Mongol conquest. The air still carries smoke from fires that burned for 3 days straight, mixing with the scent of overturned earth and something else. Something that survivors would later describe but never fully name. A woman sits motionless on the ground, surrounded by Mongol warriors who stand in a deliberate circle. Her name is Turkan Katun, age 28, wife of Sultan Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful rulers in Central Asia until 3 weeks ago. She wears the remnants of silk robes that once cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The gold thread is torn, the fabric stained with dirt and blood that is not her own. Her hands are bound not with rope but with strips of leather that will tighten if she moves, a technique the Mongols perfected for transporting captives across vast distances. The warriors around her are not celebrating. They are not drinking or shouting or displaying the chaotic energy that characterizes most conquering armies. They are methodical. They are patient. They are waiting for something specific. And Turkan Katun knows what it is because she has watched this same scene play out with the other wives, with the daughters, with the noble women who thought their status would protect them. She was wrong about many things. She was wrong about the strength of her husband's armies. She was wrong about the walls of Bukhara being unbreachable. She was wrong about the Mongols being simple barbarians who could be bought off or reasoned with. But she is not wrong about what happens next. The circle of warriors parts. A single man approaches. He is not larger than the others. He does not wear more elaborate armor. But every warrior around her has positioned himself in relation to this man, their bodies oriented toward him like iron filings near a lodestone. This is not random. This is not spontaneous. This is the culmination of a system that has been refined across thousands of miles and hundreds of cities. A system designed not just to conquer territory, but to absolutely annihilate any possibility of future resistance. She does not yet know that what they are about to do to her has a name in Mongol military doctrine. She does not know that her fate has been discussed and decided by commanders who view this as essential to empire building rather than as cruelty. She does not know that the Mongols keep detailed records of these procedures, that they have refined them based on what produces the most effective psychological impact on surviving populations. What she does know, what her body understands before her mind can fully process it, is that everything she was, everything she represented, every bit of power and status and autonomy she possessed, is about to be systematically erased. And here is what they never taught you in history class about the Mongol conquest. You know about Genghis Khan and his vast empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe. You know about the military tactics, the composite bows, the swift horses, the psychological warfare. You have seen the romanticized versions where Mongol warriors are presented as noble savages or exotic conquerors. But you have never heard about the systematic procedures applied to the wives and daughters of defeated rulers. You have never learned about the deliberate protocols designed to destroy not just armies, but the very concept of resistance. You have never discovered why chroniclers from every culture the Mongols encountered described the same practices with the same horrified language, calling them things that could not be spoken of in polite society. Tonight you will discover what Mongol military doctrine prescribed for the wives of defeated Khans, and why these procedures were considered essential rather than excessive. How the practices were systematized across the entire empire with written protocols that commanders were required to follow. What the Persian, Chinese, Russian, and Arab chroniclers documented, despite their reluctance to describe such things in detail. Why archaeological and genetic evidence confirms the scale and systematic nature of what was done. How survivors who managed to record their experiences described psychological and physical trauma that modern experts recognize immediately. If you want to understand the real history of conquest that empires tried to obscure, subscribe right now. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are listening from, because these stories deserve to reach every corner of the planet. The victims whose suffering was documented in sources from a dozen different cultures deserve to have their experiences acknowledged rather than forgotten. Let us begin with what you thought you knew about Mongol conquest, and then let us systematically dismantle those comfortable myths with evidence that has existed for 8 centuries, but has been carefully sanitized from popular understanding. The romantic narrative that dominates modern perception tells us that the Mongols were brilliant military strategists who conquered through superior tactics and organization. The actual reality that primary sources reveal is that military conquest was only one component of a comprehensive system designed to make resistance psychologically impossible for future generations. The Mongols understood something that most empires discovered only through trial and error. Destroying an army is temporary, but destroying the ability of a culture to imagine resistance is permanent. The scale of Mongol conquest remains difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. From 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes until his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire expanded to cover 12 million square miles. By the time his grandsons finished the conquests, the empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Southeast Asia. This was not gradual expansion over centuries. This was explosive conquest in a single generation that required subduing hundreds of kingdoms, defeating millions of soldiers, and controlling populations that vastly outnumbered the Mongol warriors themselves. The strategic problem the Mongols faced was unprecedented in history. They were a nomadic people numbering perhaps 1 million total, including women and children and elderly. They were attempting to control sedentary civilizations, numbering in the tens of millions. Simple military occupation was impossible. They could not leave enough warriors in each conquered city to prevent rebellion. They needed a system that would make rebellion unthinkable, even in cities where Mongol warriors were vastly outnumbered or completely absent. The solution they developed was documented in the secret history of the Mongols, in Persian chronicles by Juvayni and Rashid al-Din, in Chinese sources, in Russian chronicles, in Arab accounts, in Armenian histories, and in archaeological evidence from mass graves and genetic studies. Every source from every culture describes the same systematic practices. This was not random violence. This was calculated policy. The theoretical framework was remarkably sophisticated. The Mongols understood that power in sedentary societies was legitimized through inheritance and family connections. A defeated Khan's son could theoretically rally resistance by claiming his father's authority. A defeated Khan's brother could do the same, but a defeated Khan's wife presented a different opportunity. By systematically violating the wives and daughters of defeated rulers in very public and very specific ways, the Mongols accomplished multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. First, they destroyed the legitimacy of any children born afterward. In cultures where bloodline and purity were essential to claims of authority, uncertainty about paternity eliminated the possibility of legitimate succession. Second, they created survivors who would spread accounts of what happened, serving as deterrents to other rulers considering resistance. Third, they generated genetic mixing that would make future attempts at ethnic nationalism more complicated. Fourth, they demonstrated absolute power over the most protected members of enemy societies, showing that no one was beyond Mongol reach. The economic framework that enabled this system reveals its calculated nature. The Mongol military machine was not funded primarily through taxation but through conquest. Each successful campaign had to generate enough wealth to fund the next campaign, while also enriching the warriors enough to keep them loyal. The wives and daughters of defeated rulers represented significant economic value. They could be distributed to warriors as rewards, increasing loyalty without depleting treasury funds. They could be traded or sold. They could be used to create marriage alliances that bound defeated populations to Mongol authority. Their treatment was not emotional or spontaneous, but economically rational within the logic of conquest. The legal framework made these practices mandatory rather than optional. Mongol law, the Yasa, included specific provisions about the treatment of defeated enemies. These were not suggestions. These were commands carrying the death penalty for disobedience. Genghis Khan personally issued orders about how conquered populations should be handled, and later Khans continued and refined these protocols. We have these orders preserved in multiple sources because they were treated as fundamental law rather than as informal customs. The documentary evidence is extensive despite 8 centuries of attempted erasure. The Secret History of the Mongols, written in 1240 but describing events from Genghis Khan's lifetime, contains passages that translators have struggled with for generations because the practices described seem too calculated and systematic to be believable. Persian historian Ata Malik Juvaini, who worked for the Mongols and had access to their administrative records, documented practices in his History of the World Conqueror, written in 1260. His account is remarkably detailed because he was trying to explain to future generations why the Mongols were so effective at preventing rebellion. Chinese sources are equally explicit. The Yuanxi, the official history of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, contains administrative records showing that these practices were not isolated incidents but implemented across hundreds of cities. Russian chronicles from the 13th century describe the same patterns when Mongols conquered Rus principalities. Arab historians like Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 1220s and 30s, documented what happened in Central Asian and Middle Eastern cities. Armenian chroniclers recorded similar events. Every culture conquered by the Mongols produced sources describing the same systematic treatment of noble women. Recent scholarship has started to examine these sources more honestly, rather than dismissing them as exaggerations. Archaeological evidence from mass graves shows demographic patterns consistent with chroniclers' accounts. Genetic studies reveal patterns of Y chromosome distribution that match what historical sources describe, with Mongol genetic markers appearing suddenly and broadly across Eurasia. Modern historians using trauma-informed approaches to analyze primary sources recognize that the consistency across cultures and time periods indicates systematic policy rather than random violence. The Mongol system solved the fundamental problem of conquering vast territories with limited forces through a comprehensive approach that combined military superiority with psychological warfare, with genetic disruption, with economic incentives. The treatment of defeated rulers' wives was not a side effect of conquest. It was central to the strategic vision that allowed a relatively small, nomadic population to control the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Understanding this context is essential before we examine individual cases because it helps us recognize that what happened to specific women was not personal, it was not emotional, it was not spontaneous. It was the implementation of deliberately designed protocols intended to achieve specific strategic objectives. The horror lies not in chaos, but in calculation, not in passion, but in planning, not in individual cruelty, but in systematic policy refined through experience across hundreds of conquests. Now, let us examine what those protocols looked like when applied to specific women whose names and stories survived in the historical record. We return to Turkan Katun outside Bukhara in the spring of 1220, age 28. Wife of Sultan Muhammad II, who ruled the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in Central Asia before the Mongols arrived. Her crime, if we can call it that, was being married to a man who made the catastrophic mistake of killing Mongol ambassadors and trade envoys, an act that Genghis Khan used as justification for the complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. The claiming ritual that Turkan Katun was about to experience followed a pattern documented in sources from across the Mongol Empire. This was not improvised. This was protocol. Understanding each stage reveals the systematic nature of what was done. Stage 1 began 3 days earlier when Bukara fell after brief resistance. The Mongol commander, following standing orders, had sorted the survivors into categories. Men of fighting age were separated and would be executed or pressed into service as expendable troops for the next siege. Craftsmen with valuable skills were identified, and would be transported to Mongolia or to other parts of the empire where their expertise was needed. Religious scholars and administrators who could help govern the conquered territory were spared. Common women and children were evaluated for their potential use. Noble women were treated differently. They were immediately identified through their clothing, their jewelry, their inability to perform manual labor. Turkan Katun was recognized specifically as the Sultan's wife, because several captured officials were forced to identify her under threat of death. She was then held separately from the other prisoners in a tent guarded by senior warriors. She was not harmed during these 3 days. She was given adequate food and water. This was deliberate. The Mongols wanted her healthy and visibly unharmed for what came next. During those 3 days, messengers were sent to inform Genghis Khan that the Sultan's wife had been captured. Genghis Khan sent back specific instructions about how she should be handled. These instructions were preserved in Persian chronicles because they became model protocols used in subsequent conquests. The wife of a ruler who resisted Mongol authority was to undergo a public claiming ritual designed to demonstrate the absolute nature of Mongol victory and to create witnesses who would spread accounts to other cities, considering resistance. On the 3rd day, Turkan Katun was brought to the location outside the city where the ritual would occur. The site was selected deliberately. It was visible from the city walls, so survivors could witness. It was on open ground with no shelter or obstacles. The circle of warriors was arranged in a specific formation that Persian sources describe in detail because later commanders needed to know how to replicate it. The circle served multiple purposes. It prevented escape or rescue. It created a defined space that focused attention. It allowed all the warriors present to serve as witnesses, which was important because Mongol military culture valued eyewitness accounts as legal evidence. Most importantly, it transformed what happened from a private act into a public ceremony with political meaning. When the Mongol commander approached Turkan Katun, he spoke words that were part of the formal protocol. Multiple sources record the same phrasing in different languages, suggesting this was standardized language translated into whatever local language the victim would understand. The commander stated that her previous marriage was nullified because her husband was an enemy of the Great Khan. He stated that she now belonged to the Mongol people, and specifically to him as the conqueror of her city. He stated that her acceptance of this was mandatory, and that resistance would result in death not for her, but for other prisoners, who would be brought and executed in front of her until she complied. This last point was crucial to the psychological impact. The Mongols had learned through experience that threatening the victim herself was less effective than threatening innocents, whose deaths she could prevent through compliance. Turkan Katun was presented with a choice that was not a choice. Submit willingly to what was going to happen regardless, or watch other people die because of her resistance. Every chronicler who describes these rituals notes this same element, this same impossible choice that made victims complicit in their own violation. Turkan Katun, like most women in her position, chose to submit rather than cause additional deaths. This choice haunted survivors for the rest of their lives, creating ongoing psychological trauma that chroniclers noted. The woman blamed herself for not resisting, even though resistance would have achieved nothing except additional suffering. This self-blame was not an accident. It was part of the design. What happened next was conducted with ritualistic precision that multiple sources describe identically. The commander removed Turkan Katun's outer garments, slowly and deliberately, while the circle of warriors watched in formal silence. This was not frenzied or chaotic. This was ceremonial. Persian sources note that the removal of each garment was accompanied by statements in Mongolian that served as formal declarations of conquest. The garments themselves, the silk robes and jewelry that marked her status, were collected and would later be sent to Genghis Khan as evidence of victory. When she was unclothed, the commander proceeded with what Persian chroniclers describe using euphemistic language about taking possession and establishing ownership. The euphemisms were necessary because the chroniclers were writing for audiences that could not handle explicit descriptions. but the meaning was clear. Modern historians analyzing these texts note that the language used suggests prolonged assault designed to be visible to all witnesses rather than quick completion. The other warriors in the circle maintained their positions and their silence throughout. This was part of the ritual structure. They were witnessing and thereby validating what occurred. In Mongol culture, witnessed events carried legal force. This was not rape in the sense of uncontrolled violence. This was a formal procedure with legal implications about ownership and conquest. Chinese sources add details that Persian chronicles omitted. They note that the duration was deliberately extended, that breaks were taken, that the circle of witnesses rotated positions to ensure all present had clear views. This was theater. This was demonstration. The woman's suffering was secondary to the message being conveyed. Absolute power over the most protected members of enemy society. After the commander finished, he formally granted permission for his senior officers to repeat the claiming process. This also followed protocol documented in multiple sources. The wife of a defeated ruler was claimed first by the conquering commander, then by his officers in rank order, then by common warriors. The process could take hours or days depending on the number of warriors present and the significance of the city conquered. Turkan Katun's ordeal lasted until nightfall of the first day. She was then held overnight, and the process continued the following day with lower-ranking warriors. Persian sources indicate this continued for 3 days total, with the number of warriors involved numbering in the hundreds. Chinese sources confirm similar durations for comparable cases in their territories. The physical toll was severe but survivable. The Mongols had learned through experience that too much violence resulted in death, which ended the useful life of a valuable captive. They had refined their protocols to inflict maximum psychological damage while minimizing fatal physical trauma. Medical texts from the period describe injuries seen in survivors, and modern physicians analyzing these descriptions identify them as consistent with prolonged assault designed to create permanent damage without immediate death. The psychological impact was the primary objective. Turkan Katun was being transformed from a powerful noblewoman who had commanded servants and influenced political decisions into a broken survivor who could no longer imagine wielding authority. The transformation was visible to witnesses. Multiple sources describe how women who underwent this ritual emerged completely changed, moving differently, speaking differently, existing in states of profound dissociation. After 3 days, Turkan Katun was assigned to a specific Mongol warrior as his property. She would travel with his household, perform labor, and serve whatever purposes he required. She was no longer a sultan's wife. She was no longer noble. She was possession. Her identity had been systematically destroyed and replaced with something new. Persian chronicler Juvaini interviewed survivors of these rituals decades later while compiling his history. He records that women who experienced the public claiming ritual universally described it as worse than death. Not because the physical pain was worse than execution, but because they continued to exist afterward while carrying the memory of absolute powerlessness. Death would have been final. Survival meant carrying the experience forward into every subsequent moment of existence. One detail that multiple chroniclers note is that the Mongols deliberately ensured survivors of these rituals were released or ransomed so they could return to their own people. This was not mercy. This was strategic. These women served as living messages about what happened to those who resisted Mongol authority. Every city that heard their stories had to calculate whether resistance was worth the risk of similar treatment for their own noble families. Turkan Katun specifically survived for another 7 years, according to Persian sources. She never returned to her people because there was nothing to return to. The Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed completely. Her husband died in flight. Her sons were hunted down and killed. She lived as property of a Mongol warrior who eventually married her to a subordinate, which was common practice for aging captives. She died in 1227, the same year as Genghis Khan, in Mongolia, thousands of miles from Bukara. Her story was recorded because she was high status enough that chroniclers noted her fate. But she was one woman among thousands. The public claiming ritual was implemented in every major city the Mongols conquered. The same protocols, the same systematic procedures applied from China to Hungary, from Siberia to Iraq. What happened to Turkan Katun was not unique. It was policy. Let us examine what happened when the Mongols conquered the city of Merv in 1221, which chroniclers called the largest and wealthiest city in Central Asia at that time. The population was estimated at 1 million people. The Mongol force that besieged it numbered approximately 70,000 warriors. What happened after the city fell reveals the systematic nature of Mongol protocols when applied at massive scale. The siege of Merv lasted only 4 days. The governor surrendered, hoping to save the population. The Mongols accepted the surrender and ordered all inhabitants to evacuate the city and gather on the plain outside. This was standard procedure. It allowed the Mongols to sort the population efficiently rather than searching house by house. According to multiple Persian and Arab sources, the sorting process took 3 full days. The population of 1 million was organized into groups. Men of fighting age were separated into groups of 1,000, with each group guarded by 10 Mongol warriors. These men would either be executed or pressed into service for the next siege, depending on whether the Mongols needed expendable troops. Women and children were evaluated for their potential value. Craftsmen were identified through their tools or through informants who were offered rewards. Noble women were identified through a methodical process. The Mongols forced city officials to point out women from important families under threat that their own families would be killed if they refused to cooperate or if they lied. This created a system where the local elite became complicit in identifying targets for Mongol protocols. It also ensured that the Mongols rarely missed high-value captives. Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 1230s from accounts provided by survivors, states that the Mongols identified approximately 3,000 noble women from Merv. This number included wives and daughters of the governor, of military commanders, of wealthy merchants, of religious leaders. The Mongols considered anyone with status and wealth to be strategically valuable. These 3,000 women were separated from the general population and held in a camp guarded by Mongol warriors. They were kept for approximately 1 week while the Mongols completed the destruction of the city itself and the execution of captured fighters. This delay was not random. It allowed time for the women to understand what had happened to their city and their male relatives before the systematic processing began. The processing system reveals sophisticated logistics. With 70,000 Mongol warriors present and 3,000 noble women identified, the ratio was approximately 23 warriors per woman. The Mongols needed a system that would allow all warriors to participate, which was considered important for unit cohesion and morale, while also maintaining military order and preventing chaos. The solution they implemented was documented by multiple sources. The 3,000 women were divided into groups of approximately 100, with each group assigned to a unit of approximately 2,300 warriors. The processing of each group took 3 days following the same ritual structure as the public claiming, but at scale. Each woman underwent the ritual with all warriors in the assigned unit serving as witnesses or participants in rotation. The mathematics are horrifying, but important for understanding scale. 3,000 women divided into 30 groups, with each group processed over 3 days, means the systematic processing took approximately 3 weeks total. During this time, the Mongol army remained camped outside Merv rather than moving to the next objective. This represented a significant delay in military operations, which tells us how essential the Mongols considered this process to their overall strategy. Persian sources provide details about the organization that reveal military planning. Each unit established a defined area for the processing. Guards were posted to prevent interference or escape. The women in each group were processed sequentially rather than simultaneously, which maintained order. and ensured each received focused attention. The unit commander oversaw the process to ensure protocols were followed correctly. The women were not executed afterward. This surprises modern people who assume the Mongols killed everyone in cities they conquered. But the historical record is clear that women, especially noble women, were preserved as valuable property. After processing, each woman was assigned to a specific warrior as his property. She would travel with his household for the remainder of the campaign and beyond. This created a logistical system for managing thousands of captive women across long military campaigns. The Mongols transported these women hundreds or thousands of miles, fed them, guarded them, eventually settled them in various parts of their growing empire. The level of organization required reveals that this was not spontaneous violence, but calculated exploitation of human resources. What happened to the 3,000 noble women of Merv after their processing varied by individual case. Some were kept by the warriors they were assigned to, and eventually married, according to Mongol custom. Some were traded to other warriors or sold. Some were sent back to Mongolia to work in households there. Some were given to local collaborators as rewards for cooperation with Mongol authority. Some died from disease or childbirth or suicide during the years of captivity. Chinese sources note that women from Central Asian cities conquered in the early 1220s started appearing in Chinese territories by the late 1220s as the Mongol Empire expanded eastward. Arab sources note that some women from Merv and other destroyed cities ended up in the Middle East. Russian chronicles document women from Central Asia appearing in territories that would later become the Golden Horde. Genetic studies show markers consistent with Central Asian women contributing to populations across the entire extent of the Mongol Empire. The psychological impact of the systematic processing was documented by survivors who later testified to chroniclers. One account preserved by Giovanni describes a woman from Merv who was eventually ransomed back to a surviving relative in Nishapur 2 years after the conquest. She refused to speak about what happened during those 2 years. When pressed, she said only that the woman who entered the camp was dead and the creature that emerged was something else that had no name. This description appears in variations across sources from different cultures and time periods. Women who survived systematic processing described themselves as dead, as erased, as no longer human. Modern psychologists, analyzing these historical accounts, recognize them as describing severe dissociation, complex PTSD, and complete destruction of sense of self. The Mongol protocols achieved their objective of psychological annihilation, even in survivors who lived for decades afterward. The public nature of the processing was crucial. The Mongols deliberately conducted the rituals in locations visible from where other prisoners were held. Survivors from lower classes witnessed what happened to noble women and spread accounts to other cities that had not yet been conquered. This created a psychological weapon that worked independently of the military forces. Cities heard about Merv and surrendered without resistance, specifically to avoid the same fate for their own populations. The efficiency and scale of the systematic processing at Merv became a model that the Mongols replicated in other major cities. When they conquered Nishapur shortly after Merv, they implemented the same protocols with similar numbers. When they conquered Ray, same system. When they moved into Iraq and conquered Baghdad in 1258, same system on even larger scale. When they conquered Russian cities in the 1230s, same system adapted for different cultural contexts. One aspect that sources emphasize is that the systematic processing was implemented regardless of whether cities resisted or surrendered. Merv surrendered quickly, hoping for mercy. It received the same treatment as cities that fought. This was deliberate policy. The Mongols wanted to demonstrate that surrender did not prevent the protocols from being applied, which removed any incentive for resistance, while also showing that cooperation might slightly reduce but not eliminate suffering. The women of Merv were not victims of uncontrolled soldiers. They were processed through a system designed by military commanders, implemented by organized units, documented by administrators, and replicated across hundreds of cities. The Mongol conquest was not chaos. It was calculated implementation of protocols intended to make resistance psychologically impossible for future generations. Not all women subjected to Mongol protocols were wives of enemies. Some were daughters of allies or subordinates, who died or were defeated. Their treatment reveals another dimension of the systematic approach: the inheritance protocol that transformed women into property that could be transferred between generations. Princess Khojinbeki was the daughter of a Turkic Khan who had allied with Genghis Khan in the early stages of Mongol expansion around 1210. Her father provided warriors and supplies to Mongol campaigns in exchange for a guarantee of protection and autonomy. This was a common arrangement. Many Central Asian and Chinese rulers chose to submit and become vassals rather than resist and be destroyed. For 15 years, this arrangement functioned successfully. Khojinbeki's father ruled his territory, paid tribute to the Mongols, provided warriors when requested. His daughter was educated in court, learned multiple languages, participated in diplomatic functions. By 1225, she was 32 years old, married to a nobleman from her father's court, mother of 3 children. She lived in security and relative luxury. Then her father died of natural causes. According to Mongol law, the yasa, all property of a vassal Khan, transferred to Mongol control upon his death, and was then redistributed according to need and merit. Property included not just land and wealth, but people. Specifically, the yasa contained provisions stating that the wives and daughters of subordinate rulers became property of the Mongol Khan who had been their overlord, to be disposed of as he saw fit. Genghis Khan himself had died 2 years earlier, in 1227. Control of Khojinbeki's father's territory fell to Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's son and chosen successor. Ogedei sent officials to take inventory of all assets, including the women of the late Khan's family. This was standard procedure documented in Chinese and Mongolian sources as essential to maintaining control over vassal territories. Khojinbeki was informed that her previous marriage was void because it had not been approved by Mongol authority. This was a legal fiction. Her marriage had implicitly been tolerated for 15 years. But Ogedei was implementing a new interpretation of the yasa that gave Mongols more direct control over vassal populations. Her husband protested and was executed for questioning Mongol authority. Her children were taken and would be raised in Mongol households as servants. She was then transported to the Mongol capital at Karakoram, a journey of approximately 1,000 miles that took 3 months. Chinese sources describe the transportation system for captive women during this period. Groups of 10 to 50 women were chained together and marched overland with minimal food and no shelter. Those who could not maintain the pace were killed to avoid slowing the group. Approximately 30% of women died during transport according to administrative records that tracked losses. Khojinbeki survived the journey. Upon arrival at Karakoram, she underwent evaluation by Mongol officials who determined her assignment. She was 32 years old, which was considered past prime childbearing age, but still useful. She spoke Turkish, Persian, and some Mongolian. She had court training and administrative experience. She was literate, which was rare. Based on these factors, she was assigned to the household of a Mongol general as an administrator rather than as a concubine. This might seem like mercy, but sources from women in similar situations describe it as a different form of violation. She was forced to manage the very system that had destroyed her life. She kept records of other captive women. She organized households that included women taken from her own people. She became complicit in maintaining the protocols that had been applied to her. The inheritance protocol affected thousands of women across the Mongol Empire as the first generation of allied Khans died and their property transferred to Mongol control. This was not random or spontaneous. This was systematic implementation of written law. The yasa provisions about inheriting subordinate rulers' families served multiple purposes. First, it prevented vassal territories from developing independent dynasties that might eventually challenge Mongol authority. Second, It eliminated bloodline continuity that could serve as basis for resistance movements. Third, it provided a steady supply of educated, high-status women for Mongol households without requiring additional conquests. Fourth, it demonstrated that even cooperation and submission did not protect families from Mongol control. Kojin Beki's specific fate reveals the long-term implementation of the protocol. She served in the Mongol general's household for 11 years. She eventually married a lower-ranked Mongol officer in an arrangement made by her owner. She had 2 more children who were considered Mongol and were raised with Mongol language and customs. She died in 1248 at age 55 in Mongolia, far from her homeland, having spent more than half her life in Mongol captivity. Her story survived because one of her sons became a minor official in the Mongol administration and commissioned a brief family history preserved in a Chinese text. Most women subjected to the inheritance protocol left no records. We know the system existed because the Asa provisions were documented and because administrative records tracked transfers of property, including women. The scale of the inheritance protocol increased dramatically as the Mongol Empire expanded. By the 1240s, the empire controlled most of Asia and large parts of Europe. Every time a vassal ruler died, his female relatives became available for redistribution. Chinese sources suggest that thousands of women per year were processed through this system during the peak expansion period. The psychological impact of the inheritance protocol was different from but equally devastating as the conquest protocols. Women like Kojin Beki had believed they were protected through their family's cooperation with Mongol authority. When they discovered that cooperation offered no protection, that their status and safety could be revoked instantly based on legal technicalities, it created profound trauma and helplessness. Some women subjected to the inheritance protocol committed suicide rather than accepting transfer to Mongol control. Chinese sources document multiple cases of women killing themselves when officials arrived to take inventory after their fathers or husbands died. The Mongols responded by implementing preventive measures. Women from vassal families were monitored closely after a ruler's death and were physically prevented from accessing means of suicide. This was not humanitarian concern, but economic calculation. Dead women had no value. The inheritance protocol also affected Mongol women, which reveals the comprehensive nature of gender control in Mongol society. When a Mongol man died, his widows and daughters were inherited by his brothers or sons from different wives. This levirate marriage system ensured that women remained within clan control. The protocols applied to conquered women were extensions of systems that already existed within Mongol culture, adapted and intensified for application to subjugated populations. Kojin Beki's story demonstrates that resistance to Mongol expansion did not guarantee the worst treatment, while cooperation did not guarantee protection. The systematic protocols were applied to all women of status, regardless of their family's relationship with Mongol authority. The only women who escaped were those from such low status that the Mongols did not consider them worth processing, or those who managed to flee to territories the Mongols never conquered. When the Mongols conquered Samarkand in 1220, they faced a city of approximately 300,000 people that surrendered after 5 days. The surrender saved the population from massacre, but not from systematic processing. What happened in Samarkand reveals how the Mongols implemented protocols in cities that cooperated rather than resisted. Arab and Persian sources describe the sorting process in detail. All inhabitants were ordered to evacuate the city and assemble on the plain outside. The Mongols then divided them into groups for processing. Men were separated and evaluated. Women were sorted by age and status. Children were separated from parents. The focus here is on what happened to the approximately 5,000 women identified as noble or wealthy. These were wives and daughters of merchants, administrators, religious leaders, military officers. They were not royal family members, which meant they would be processed differently from the very highest status captives. The Mongols implemented what sources call collective processing. Rather than individual public claiming rituals like Turkan Katun experienced, These women underwent group rituals designed to maximize efficiency. They were divided into groups of 50, and each group was processed by a unit of 1,000 warriors over 3 days. The mechanics of collective processing differed from individual rituals. The women were held in an enclosed space, either a building or a fenced area, rather than an open ground. This prevented observation by general witnesses, but allowed the assigned unit to access them systematically. The warriors entered the space in shifts, with each shift lasting several hours before rotating to the next shift. This system accomplished multiple objectives. It processed large numbers of women efficiently without the delays that individual rituals required. It maintained military discipline by enforcing shift rotations rather than allowing chaotic free access. It reduced the visibility of what was happening, which the Mongols had learned could cause problems if witnessing populations became too agitated. It standardized the experience across all women in the group, which simplified subsequent property assignments. Persian sources interviewed survivors of collective processing in Samarkand, who were later ransomed or released. Their testimony reveals the psychological mechanism that made collective processing effective. The women could hear but not see what was happening to others in the group. This created anticipatory terror that was often more psychologically devastating than the actual experience. By the time a woman's turn came, she was already broken psychologically, which reduced resistance and simplified the process. The 3-day duration was standardized across collective processing operations in multiple cities. This was long enough to ensure all warriors in a unit had opportunity to participate, which commanders considered important for morale and unit cohesion. It was short enough to maintain operational tempo and prevent the army from being delayed excessively. It was calculated to inflict severe psychological trauma without causing excessive physical death, which would waste valuable property. After processing, the 5,000 women from Samarkand were assigned to specific warriors based on a distribution system documented in Mongol administrative records. Officers received first choice and could select multiple women. Common warriors received 1 woman each, with extras distributed to those who had shown particular valor or skill. Warriors who had died during the siege had their shares distributed among survivors. This distribution system created a market economy within the Mongol military. Warriors could trade the women they received for other goods or for women with more desirable skills or characteristics. Some warriors accumulated multiple captives for purposes of wealth accumulation, since women could be sold or traded outside the army. This commodification of captive women was systematic and documented in administrative texts that tracked property ownership. The women of Samarkand were dispersed across the Mongol Empire over the following years. Some remained with the warriors who received them in the original distribution. Some were traded to other Mongols. Some were sold to merchants who supplied the Mongol military. Some were sent to Mongolia to work in household production. Some were given to collaborators in newly conquered territories as incentives for cooperation. Tracking the fate of Samarkand's women reveals the scope of the dispersal system. Genetic studies show Central Asian female lineages appearing suddenly in populations from China to Russia during the 13th century, consistent with mass movement of women. Architectural and artistic evidence shows Central Asian aesthetic influences spreading across the empire, carried by craftswomen from conquered cities. Administrative records from later decades show women from Samarkand appearing as far away as Hungary and Korea. The psychological aftermath of collective processing was documented by multiple chroniclers. Women who survived described complete loss of identity and purpose. Many never recovered psychologically. Those who were eventually released or ransomed and returned to surviving relatives often could not reintegrate into their previous society. Some committed suicide weeks or months after release. Some lived in dissociated states that contemporary sources describe as walking death. One survivor from Samarkand, whose testimony was preserved by Juvayni, described collective processing as experiencing death without ending. She explained that during the 3 days, each woman died internally multiple times, but the body continued functioning, and there was no escape through final death. This description of psychological death while physically alive appears in survivor accounts across different cultures and time periods, suggesting it was a common response to these protocols. The collective processing of Samarkand became a model for handling mid-sized cities. Cities with populations between 100,000 and 500,000 typically underwent this system. Smaller cities might receive more individualized treatment. Larger cities like Merv required the massive sorting operation described earlier. The Mongols adapted their protocols based on scale, while maintaining the essential elements of systematic processing. The efficiency of collective processing reveals the bureaucratic sophistication of Mongol military operations. Managing 5,000 captive women through 3-day processing operations while maintaining siege operations while preventing disorder required detailed planning and oversight. The fact that the Mongols accomplished this repeatedly across hundreds of cities demonstrates organizational capacity that many historians have overlooked while focusing on military tactics. The long-term impact on Samarkand itself was total destruction of the existing social order. The city's elite families were eliminated through execution of men and dispersal of women. The wealth that generations had accumulated was looted. The city's population dropped from 300,000 to perhaps 30,000 within a year. Those who survived were traumatized witnesses who spread accounts of what happened, serving as deterrents to resistance in cities not yet conquered. Samarkand eventually recovered and was rebuilt under Mongol rule, but it was a different city with a different population. The continuity with its pre-conquest history was severed. This was the strategic objective. The Mongols did not simply conquer territory. They erased existing power structures so completely that resistance became unimaginable for generations. Most women subjected to Mongol protocols left no direct testimony, but a remarkable document survived in a Persian manuscript discovered in the 20th century, a first-person account by a woman named Fatima, who lived through the conquest of Herat in 1221. Her testimony provides details that official histories omitted. Fatima was 17 years old when the Mongols besieged Herat. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, educated and literate, able to write in Persian and Arabic. When the city fell after siege, she was identified as noble status and separated for processing. What makes her account remarkable is that she survived, was eventually ransomed, and decades later wrote down her experience in explicit detail that she asked to be preserved for future generations as evidence of what the Mongols did. Her account begins with the sorting process. She describes being pulled from a group of common women by Mongol officials, who examined her hands and judged them too soft for manual labor, marking her as privileged. She was taken to a holding area with approximately 800 other women identified as noble. They were guarded by Mongol warriors, who prevented escape but did not yet harm them. For 3 days they waited while the Mongols completed other operations in the city. Fatima describes the psychological state of the women during this waiting period. They knew what was coming because survivors from other cities had spread accounts. Some women tried to comfort each other. Some prayed continuously. Some became catatonic with fear. Fatima herself tried to plan escape, but realized it was impossible with guards constantly present. On the 4th day, they were divided into groups. Fatima's group contained approximately 80 women. They were taken to a walled courtyard within the city that had been cleared of other people. Mongol warriors surrounded the courtyard. Fatima estimates there were 500 to 1,000 warriors present, based on the size of the group and the protocols she had heard described. What follows in her account is the most explicit first-person description of collective processing that survived in any historical source. She describes the group being stripped of their clothing. She describes being unable to see what happened to other women, but hearing sounds that made the imagination worse than sight could be. She describes her turn coming and experiencing what she says cannot be adequately described in words. Her account emphasizes not physical pain, though she describes that too, but psychological destruction. She writes that, during the experience, the person who was Fatima disappeared and something else took her place. something that could watch what was happening without being connected to it. This is dissociation described in medieval language. She says she felt like she was floating above the courtyard, watching someone else in her body. After it ended, she was left in the courtyard with the other women for the night. She describes that no one spoke. Many women appeared catatonic. Some died during the night. Fatima believes from their spirits giving up even though their bodies had survived. This description of death from psychological trauma without physical cause appears in multiple historical accounts from this period. The next day, the processing continued with different warriors. Fatima's account of the second and third days is less detailed, which she acknowledges. She says the dissociation became total and she has only fragments of memory. This is consistent with how trauma affects memory formation. On the fourth day, she was assigned to a Mongol warrior named Kenbish. She would remain his property for 7 years. Her account describes those years in surprising detail, providing information about daily life in Mongol military camps that no other source offers from a female perspective. She describes traveling thousands of miles with the Mongol army as it continued conquering. She describes the efficiency of camp organization, the daily routines, the hierarchy among warriors. She describes other captive women from different cities, including one from Baghdad and one from Kiev, showing the geographic scope of the dispersal. She describes the complete lack of autonomy, being entirely dependent on Kenbish's decisions for food, shelter, survival. She also describes developing a complex relationship with her captor. This is difficult for modern readers, but important for understanding how captives survived. She learned Mongolian. She performed duties efficiently. She tried to anticipate Kenbish's needs to avoid punishment. This was not cooperation born of agreement, but of calculation for survival. Yet, over time, she developed what psychologists would now recognize as trauma bonding, experiencing moments of gratitude towards someone who occasionally showed small kindnesses, even though he was fundamentally responsible for her captivity. After 7 years, Kenbish was killed in battle against Song dynasty forces in China. According to Mongol custom, Fatima became property of Kenbish's brother. This brother was less interested in keeping captives and sold her to a Persian merchant who was supplying the Mongol army. The merchant ransomed her back to her surviving uncle in Herat for a substantial sum. Fatima returned to Herat in 1228 to find a completely different city. Most of the population was new, drawn from other areas. Few people from her previous life survived. Her parents were dead, killed during the conquest. Her siblings were dispersed or dead. The life she had known was erased. She never married. Her account suggests this was partly because she could not bear intimacy after her experiences, partly because her status as a returned captive made her unmarriageable by the standards of her society. She lived with her uncle's family and eventually began writing. Her written account was completed around 1245, nearly 25 years after the events. She states explicitly that she writes it as evidence for future generations that these events actually happened and were not exaggerations. She wants people to know what the Mongols did, how systematic it was, how effective it was at destroying resistance. She also writes with remarkable insight about the psychological mechanisms involved. She describes how the processing transformed women from thinking beings into objects who could not imagine resistance. She describes how the trauma bonding made captives complicit in maintaining the system. She describes how survivors could never fully recover because the experience fundamentally changed their sense of self and their understanding of the world. Her account ends with a reflection on why she survived when so many others died. She concludes that she survived not because she was stronger, but because she was more willing to disconnect from her own humanity. She writes that the girl who entered the courtyard in Herat died there, and the woman who emerged was a different creature entirely, one that could endure by refusing to fully exist. Fatima's account was preserved in a single manuscript that was copied a few times over the centuries, but never widely distributed. The explicit content made it unsuitable for broad circulation in Islamic societies that preferred not to discuss these matters publicly. It was rediscovered in the 20th century and finally published in full in the late 1990s, nearly 800 years after it was written. Modern historians and psychologists analyzing her account recognize it as an extraordinarily valuable document. It confirms details from other sources while adding information available nowhere else. It describes trauma responses with precision that matches modern clinical understanding. It provides perspective that official histories, written by men and focused on military and political events, completely missed. Fatima died in 1255, aged approximately 51. She left no children. Her testimony is her only legacy, but it is a profound one. She gave voice to experiences that most women subjected to Mongol protocols could never articulate and that societies preferred to forget. To understand the systematic nature of these protocols, we must examine them from the perpetrator's perspective. Fortunately, a remarkable source survived: campaign records compiled by one of Subutais' subordinate officers during the Western campaigns of 1236 to 1242. These records provide administrative detail about implementation of protocols from the Mongol viewpoint. Subutai was one of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, responsible for conquering territories from Siberia to Hungary. His campaigns were characterized by remarkable efficiency and thorough implementation of Mongol policies. The subordinate officer who compiled these records was documenting operations for reporting to Mongol High Command, creating evidence of compliance with orders and effectiveness of tactics. The records are remarkably clinical and devoid of moral reflection. They treat the processing of captive women as logistical challenges equivalent to managing food supplies or organizing siege equipment. This administrative perspective reveals how the Mongols systematized violence to the point where participants did not engage with it as violence, but as procedure. One section details the conquest of Ryazan in 1237, one of the first major Russian cities to fall. The records note that the city contained approximately 50,000 people before conquest, and that sorting operations identified 700 noble women for processing. The records then detail the distribution system used to allocate these women among 30,000 Mongol warriors. The mathematics are straightforward and handled with same language used for distributing other resources. 700 women divided among 30,000 warriors meant most warriors received no allocation from this particular city. The records note that priority went to units that had participated in the actual siege rather than units held in reserve. Warriors who participated received allocation chances through a lottery system that commanders supervised. This lottery detail is significant. It shows that even the distribution of captive women was regulated rather than chaotic. Warriors could not simply take women. They had to receive allocation through official channels. This maintained discipline and prevented conflicts within the army. It also created a system where women were treated explicitly as property managed through institutional processes. The records discuss challenges that arose during processing operations. One challenge was maintaining operational tempo while implementing protocols. Processing 700 women with participation from all warriors and siege units took approximately 2 weeks, which delayed the army's advance to the next objective. The officer notes this as a lesson learned. In future operations, processing should begin immediately after city fall rather than waiting for other operations to complete, enabling parallel rather than sequential processes. Another challenge was managing the physical space for collective processing. The officer describes commandeering several large buildings in Ryazan and organizing shifts that rotated through these buildings. He notes that organization was critical for preventing disorder and ensuring all warriors received appropriate opportunities. The clinical language treats human beings as logistical problems to be solved through better organization. The records also discuss medical considerations. Some women died during processing despite efforts to prevent fatal trauma. The officer notes that losses averaged approximately 8 to 12% across multiple cities during the campaign. This was considered acceptable, but improvable. He recommends that future operations include assigned medical personnel who could treat injuries and reduce fatal losses, preserving more valuable property. This recommendation reveals the economic calculation underlying everything. The Mongols were not sadistic. They were not interested in causing death or excessive injury. They wanted to extract maximum value from captives, which meant keeping them alive and functional. The protocols were carefully calibrated to inflict psychological destruction while minimizing physical mortality. The records describe the distribution of women from Ryazan throughout the Mongol forces. Approximately 300 remained with the field army, assigned to warriors as described. Another 200 were sent back to previously conquered territories to be settled in Mongol administrative centers. 100 were sent further east toward Mongolia itself. The remaining 100 were distributed to local collaborators who had assisted the Mongol conquest with intelligence or supplies. This dispersal system served multiple purposes that the officer explains explicitly. It prevented concentration of captives from a single city, which reduced risk of organized resistance or escape. It created economic value across multiple territories rather than concentrating it in one location. It provided ongoing incentive for warriors in rear areas who received allocations from cities they did not personally participate in conquering. It built loyalty among collaborators who received valuable property as rewards. The officer also discusses lessons learned about psychological impact. He notes that cities conquered later in the campaign often surrendered more quickly than earlier cities because refugees had spread accounts of what happened to noble women in cities that resisted. This demonstrates that the Mongols understood and deliberately used the processing protocols as psychological weapons that affected cities they had not yet reached. One section discusses specific techniques that proved most effective at creating psychological impact. The officer notes that public processing created better deterrent effects than private processing because witnesses spread more vivid accounts. He notes that processing noble women was more strategically valuable than processing common women because noble families in other cities identified more strongly with noble victims. He recommends that protocols emphasize visible transformation of high-status women to maximize psychological impact on future targets. The records also reveal adaptation of protocols based on cultural differences. The officer notes that Russian Orthodox Christianity created different sensitivities than Islam or Buddhism. Russian noble families placed high importance on premarital virginity and wifely chastity, which meant violations had different social implications than in cultures with different values. He recommends that protocols in Christian territories emphasize elements that conflict most sharply with local religious values to maximize psychological destruction of social structures. This adaptation reveals sophisticated understanding of cultural psychology. The Mongols were not simply applying identical protocols everywhere. They modified implementation based on what would be most psychologically effective in each cultural context. The core system remained constant, but details changed based on strategic analysis. The records continue through multiple cities: Moscow, Vladimir, Kozelsk, eventually Kyiv. Each entry follows similar format: city name, population estimate, number of noble women identified, distribution system used, lessons learned, recommendations for future operations. The repetitive structure reveals how thoroughly systematized the protocols were across hundreds of conquests. Near the end of the campaign records, the officer provides summary statistics. Over the 6-year Western campaign from 1236 to 1242, Subutais forces conquered approximately 40 major cities and 200 smaller settlements in Russian and Eastern European territories. Total population affected numbered in the millions. Total noble women processed exceeded 30,000. Distribution patterns sent these women across the Mongol Empire from Korea to Hungary. The officer concludes with assessment of strategic effectiveness. He judges that the protocols achieved their objectives of preventing sustained resistance in conquered territories. Areas where protocols were implemented thoroughly showed significantly less rebellion than areas where military necessity prevented full implementation. This correlation between thorough protocol implementation and successful long-term control became argument for ensuring adequate time and resources were allocated to these operations in future campaigns. The document ends with recommendations for codifying these procedures into formal military doctrine. The officer argues that what had been learned through experience should be written explicitly into training and command guidance, so future campaigns could implement protocols more efficiently from the start, rather than learning through trial and error. These campaign records were preserved in Mongol archives and later translated into Chinese during the Yuan dynasty. They survived because they were considered valuable administrative documents, demonstrating effective military organization. No one involved in creating or preserving them saw reason to hide or destroy them because, from the Mongol perspective, these were not shameful actions but effective tactics. Reading these records today is profoundly disturbing, precisely because of their clinical nature. The officer shows no recognition that he is describing systematic trauma inflicted on thousands of women. He shows no moral qualms about his role in organizing and implementing these protocols. He discusses human suffering with the same tone as discussing horse logistics or arrow supplies. This is how systematic violence functions. It does not require perpetrators who are monsters. It requires systems that normalize violence, that treat it as procedure, that reward efficient implementation and punish questioning. The Mongol military system accomplished this at remarkable scale and effectiveness. The final case study is not about an individual woman, but about the measurable long-term impact that modern science has revealed through genetic and demographic analysis. This transforms what might seem like ancient history into verifiable scientific evidence of systematic practices affecting millions of women across centuries. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics that made international headlines. They had analyzed Y chromosome markers across populations from Central Asia to Eastern Europe. Y chromosomes are passed only from fathers to sons, making them useful for tracking male lineage. The study revealed that approximately 16 million men living today, roughly 0.5% of the world's male population, carry genetic markers indicating descent from a common male ancestor who lived approximately 1,000 years ago in Mongolia. Statistical analysis identified this common ancestor as likely being Genghis Khan or one of his close male relatives. The pattern of distribution matched exactly the extent of the Mongol Empire at its height. The frequency was highest in Mongolia and Central Asia, declining gradually toward the edges of former Mongol territories. No other explanation fit the data better than descent from Mongol nobility with extraordinary reproductive success. But the study's implications go beyond Genghis Khan's direct descendants. Follow-up research examined female genetic lineages through mitochondrial DNA, which passes only from mothers to children. These studies revealed different patterns that complement the male lineage data in disturbing ways. Female lineages across the former Mongol Empire show sudden changes in the 13th century, consistent with massive movement of women from conquered territories. Chinese women's mitochondrial DNA appears in Central Asian populations. Central Asian women's DNA appears in Russian populations. Persian women's DNA appears across vast distances. This genetic dispersal matches exactly what historical sources describe: systematic capture and distribution of women from conquered cities across the entire empire. The scale revealed by genetics is staggering. Conservative estimates based on genetic diffusion models suggest that millions of women were displaced from their origin populations and redistributed across the Mongol Empire during the 13th and 14th centuries. This is not speculation. This is measurable genetic evidence that can be dated with reasonable precision through mutation rate analysis. Demographic studies complement the genetic evidence. Historical demographers analyzing population records from before and after Mongol conquests find consistent patterns. Cities suffered population crashes of 50 to 90%. Ratios of men to women in conquered populations became severely skewed, with far fewer men surviving. Recovery of pre-conquest population levels took generations, and the recovered populations showed genetic characteristics indicating mixing with Mongol lineages. Specific examples illustrate the patterns. Baghdad had an estimated population of 1 million before the Mongol conquest in 1258. Post-conquest estimates range from 150,000 to 300,000. The city that eventually recovered was genetically distinct from the pre-conquest population based on modern sampling of ancient and modern DNA. Similar patterns appear in cities across the entire conquest zone. Chinese population records are particularly detailed because China maintained bureaucratic continuity through the Mongol period. The population of northern China dropped from approximately 120 million in 1200 to perhaps 60 million by 1300. This catastrophic decline was not purely from killing during conquests. It included displacement, disruption of agriculture, disease, and significantly, redistribution of women that prevented normal population recovery. Russian territories show similar patterns. Chronicles record population in major cities before conquest and decades after. Consistently, populations dropped by 2/3 or more and took a century to recover. Sex ratios were severely imbalanced, with chroniclers noting shortages of women for marriage that persisted for generations. Archaeological evidence provides physical confirmation. Mass graves from Mongol conquest periods show demographic patterns of mostly male remains in cities where battles occurred, while corresponding female remains either are absent, suggesting removal rather than death, or show evidence of trauma consistent with violence before death. Burial patterns changed after conquests, with communal graves replacing individual burials and grave goods indicating sharp declines in wealth. Modern historians synthesizing all this evidence have revised estimates of the human cost of Mongol conquests. Earlier estimates focused on direct deaths from military action. Current estimates, incorporating genetics, demographics, and archaeological evidence, suggest total impact on conquered populations was far more severe. Estimates now range from 30 to 60 million people dead or permanently displaced, with women comprising disproportionate share of displacement rather than death. The genetic evidence also reveals patterns about what happened to displaced women over generations. The Mongol male Y chromosome markers spread successfully, indicating men who carried them reproduced extensively. But the patterns of female mitochondrial DNA from conquered populations show them dispersed across vast distances and mixed into multiple subsequent populations. This suggests systematic dispersal prevented genetic clustering that would maintain ethnic identity. This has implications for understanding Mongol strategic objectives. The dispersal was not random or accidental. It was calculated to prevent conquered populations from maintaining ethnic or genetic cohesion that could form bases for nationalist resistance movements. By thoroughly mixing populations genetically, the Mongols created situations where future resistance organizers could not appeal to pure bloodlines or ethnic solidarity. Some researchers argue that the genetic impact should be considered a form of biological warfare, though that term is anachronistic. The Mongols did not understand genetics in modern sense, but they understood bloodlines and inheritance. Their systematic practices had the effect of genetic disruption, whether or not they conceptualized it that way. The long-term impact on conquered societies extended far beyond the immediate conquest period. Genetic mixing created populations with ambiguous ethnic identities. Cultural practices were disrupted when women who carried them were removed and replaced with women from different cultures. Languages were affected when mothers speaking different languages raised children in displaced communities. Russia provides clear example. Pre-Mongol Russian principalities were ethnically and genetically related Slavic populations. Post-Mongol populations show significantly higher frequencies of Central Asian genetic markers, highest in areas that were longest under Mongol control. This mixing contributed to cultural differences between Russia and Western Europe that persist today. China shows similar patterns. Northern China, which experienced longer and more intensive Mongol occupation, shows genetic evidence of Central Asian mixing that is less prevalent in southern China, which the Mongols conquered later and controlled less thoroughly. These genetic differences correlate with cultural and linguistic distinctions between northern and southern China. Central Asia itself shows the most dramatic mixing. Pre-Mongol populations were already diverse, but Mongol conquests added layers of genetic mixing from displaced populations from China, Persia, Russia, and elsewhere. The result is contemporary Central Asian populations that are among the most genetically diverse in the world, carrying markers from populations separated by thousands of miles. The genetic legacy demonstrates that the systematic practices the Mongols applied to conquered women were not isolated incidents, but sustained policies affecting millions of women across multiple generations. The evidence is literally written in the genes of hundreds of millions of people alive today. We carry in our DNA the proof of what happened to women during the Mongol conquests. This transforms historical accounts from potentially exaggerated chronicles into verified truth. When genetics confirms what Persian and Chinese and Russian and Arab sources all described independently, we must accept that the systematic processing of captive women occurred at massive scale, exactly as documented. The Mongol protocols were not propaganda or myth. They were historical reality, with measurable biological consequences that persist 8 centuries later. Understanding individual cases reveals human cost. Understanding system infrastructure reveals how such horror became normal, accepted, and maintained across vast territories for generations. The Mongol system for processing captive women required sophisticated infrastructure that reveals deliberate design rather than spontaneous violence. The infrastructure operated at 3 levels: strategic planning, tactical implementation, and administrative maintenance. Strategic planning occurred at highest levels of Mongol command. The Yasa, the law code Genghis Khan established, included explicit provisions about treatment of conquered populations. These provisions were not suggestions but commands carrying death penalty for warriors who disobeyed. The Secret History of the Mongols, the Mongol Chronicle, describes deliberations about policies toward conquered peoples and includes rationales for systematic practices. This was policy debated and decided by leadership, not actions improvised by soldiers. Tactical implementation required training and standardization. Mongol warriors were trained not just in military techniques, but in occupation procedures. Chinese sources document that Mongol military training included instruction in sorting populations, identifying high-value captives, managing logistics of transporting captives, and implementing processing protocols. This training ensured that protocols were applied consistently across the empire, regardless of which specific commanders or units conquered a given city. Administrative maintenance involved record-keeping and oversight. Mongol administrators tracked captive women as property, maintaining registers of who owned whom, recording transfers and sales, documenting deaths and births. Chinese and Persian administrative documents that survived show remarkable bureaucratic attention to managing human property. This was not casual tracking, but formal administration with official protocols for documentation. The geographic scope of infrastructure was unprecedented. The Mongol Empire, at its height, included permanent infrastructure for managing captive populations across territory, from Korea to Hungary. This included designated routes for transporting captives, supply stations, holding facilities, administrative centers for recording transactions. The logistical sophistication rivals modern state apparatus. Communication systems ensured consistency. The Mongol postal system, the YAM, allowed rapid communication across vast distances. Orders from central command could reach frontline units in weeks. Reports from field commanders reached leadership with same speed. This enabled centralized control of policies that were implemented thousands of miles away. Economic incentives ensured compliance at all levels. Warriors who captured cities received shares of captive women as property with economic value. Commanders who efficiently implemented protocols received promotions and rewards. Administrators who maintained accurate records received stipends. The system created material incentives for everyone involved to participate effectively. Legal framework made protocols mandatory. Warriors who violated protocols by killing women designated for processing, or by claiming women outside proper distribution procedures, faced severe punishment, including execution. The system was not optional. It was enforced through military discipline backed by threat of death. Training infrastructure ensured new warriors learned protocols. As the Mongol military grew through recruitment of conquered populations, new warriors underwent training that included instruction in processing procedures. The system perpetuated itself by training each generation in its maintenance. The infrastructure operated continuously for generations. From Genghis Khan's initial conquests in early 1200s through the fragmentation of the empire in mid-1300s, these systems functioned across 2 centuries. Even after the unified empire fractured into successor states like the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, these states continued implementing similar protocols because the infrastructure and training remained in place. The psychological sophistication of Mongol protocols reveals understanding of human behavior that modern psychology only formalized in the 20th century. Multiple mechanisms combined to break resistance and create lasting trauma. Systematic dehumanization began with sorting procedures that literally categorized people as property, being examined, evaluated, and assigned monetary value destroys sense of self as autonomous human. The Mongols understood that treating people as objects makes them begin to internalize that status, reducing psychological resistance. Public visibility of violations served multiple psychological purposes. For victims, knowing witnesses observed destroyed remaining dignity and sense of privacy. For witnesses, seeing violations of high-status women destroyed any belief that status provided protection. For perpetrators, public performance created shared complicity that bound units together through collective guilt. Duration of trauma was carefully calibrated. Multi-day processing protocols ensured trauma was not single overwhelming event, but sustained experience that prevented psychological recovery. Modern research on trauma confirms that sustained trauma is far more psychologically destructive than single incidents, because it prevents the mind from processing and integrating the experience. Psychological isolation was built into every stage. Victims were separated from anyone who had known them before, preventing emotional support that might enable resilience. They were surrounded by people who viewed them as property rather than as humans worthy of empathy. This isolation made psychological survival nearly impossible. Destruction of identity through multiple mechanisms created lasting damage. Removing clothing destroyed external markers of status. Assigning new roles as property destroyed social identity. Forced participation in systems that violated one's values destroyed moral identity. Creating uncertainty about paternity of future children destroyed genetic identity. The comprehensive attack on identity from multiple angles simultaneously made recovery extraordinarily difficult. Trauma bonding created psychological dependence on captors. Victims who were occasionally shown small kindnesses by owners developed gratitude and attachment despite the fundamental horror of their situation. This adaptation, which modern psychology recognizes as survival mechanism, made victims complicit in their own continued captivity. Systematic prevention of suicide demonstrates understanding of psychological vulnerability. The Mongols recognized that many captive women would attempt suicide if given opportunity. They implemented preventive measures, including constant surveillance, removal of anything that could be used for self-harm, and threats that suicide would result in punishment of other captives. This forced women to continue living despite psychological devastation. Installation of learned helplessness through unpredictable control made resistance seem futile. Captives learned that nothing they did reliably improved their situation. Compliance did not prevent additional trauma. Resistance led to punishment, but compliance led to trauma anyway. This created a psychological state where initiative and resistance disappeared. Exploitation of cultural values maximized psychological impact. In cultures that valued female chastity, violations destroyed social standing. In cultures that valued bloodline purity, genetic mixing destroyed legitimacy. The Mongols adapted their protocols to exploit whatever cultural values would create maximum psychological destruction in each society they conquered. Long-term psychological impact was documented by contemporary chroniclers who describe survivors as fundamentally changed. Terms like living death, walking corpses, and soulless vessels appear across sources from multiple cultures, all describing the same phenomenon of profound psychological destruction in women who physically survived Mongol protocols. Modern trauma psychology confirms that the techniques the Mongols used are extraordinarily effective at destroying psychological resilience and creating lasting damage. Isolation, sustained trauma, identity destruction, public humiliation, removal of control, prevention of recovery, exploitation of cultural values. These are precisely the techniques that modern research identifies as most psychologically devastating. The Mongols discovered through experience what took modern science centuries to understand systematically. The immediate legacy of Mongol protocols spread across Eurasia as other empires observed and adapted these techniques. The strategic effectiveness was undeniable, making resistance to Mongol authority rare, even in territories where Mongol military presence was minimal. This success inspired imitation by subsequent conquerors who studied Mongol methods. The Timurids in the 14th and 15th centuries explicitly modeled themselves on Mongol precedents. Timur the Lame, despite not being Genghis Khan's descendant, claimed Mongol legitimacy and implemented similar protocols when conquering Central Asia and the Middle East. Persian sources describe practices in Timurid conquests that directly parallel Mongol methods from a century earlier, suggesting conscious imitation of proven techniques. The Ottoman Empire, expanding through the 15th and 16th centuries, employed similar systematic approaches to managing conquered populations. Ottoman Devshirme system, which took boys from conquered Christian populations and converted them into elite Janissary warriors, parallels Mongol practices of destroying ethnic continuity through systematic removal of children. Ottoman treatment of women in conquered territories followed patterns recognizable from Mongol precedents. The Qing dynasty in China, established by Manchu conquerors in the 17th century, studied Yuan dynasty administrative records from the Mongol period. Qing policies toward Han Chinese populations show influence of Mongol techniques adapted for different contexts. The requirement that Han men adopt Manchu hairstyles, for example, served similar psychological functions as Mongol protocols, visible marking of submission that destroyed sense of cultural autonomy. European colonialism adopted similar systematic approaches when conquering overseas territories. The comprehensive systems for managing conquered populations, including systematic sexual violence, parallel Mongol methods. Whether this resulted from direct knowledge of Mongol precedents or from independent discovery of similar techniques, the functional parallels are striking. Long-term genetic and demographic impact is measurable in contemporary populations. Genetic studies discussed earlier reveal that millions of people today carry biological evidence of Mongol conquest practices. This is perhaps the most enduring legacy. The Mongol protocols literally changed the genetic composition of populations across Eurasia in ways still visible 8 centuries later. Cultural memory retained traumatic impact across generations. Folklore, legends, and historical narratives from Russia, China, Central Asia, and the Middle East preserve memories of the Mongol conquest as unprecedented catastrophe. The consistency of this cultural memory across diverse societies suggests the trauma was profound and long-lasting. Psychological and social patterns may have been transmitted across generations through mechanisms modern psychology is beginning to understand. Epigenetic research suggests that severe trauma can affect gene expression in ways transmitted to children and grandchildren. Populations subjected to Mongol conquest may have passed trauma responses through multiple generations, genetically as well as culturally. Political patterns in regions conquered by Mongols show lasting effects. Centralized authoritarian governance became norm in Russia, China, and Central Asian states that were under longest Mongol control. Whether Mongol influence contributed to these political traditions is debated, but the correlation is notable. The most disturbing legacy may be the normalization of systematic sexual violence as tool of conquest. The effectiveness of Mongol protocols established precedent that subsequent empires studied and adapted. The techniques for using violations of women as strategic weapon became part of the arsenal of imperial power employed by conquerors from the 13th century through modern conflicts. Understanding why this history was hidden reveals how power conceals its methods even across centuries. The Mongols themselves did not attempt to hide these practices during their rule. The protocols were documented in administrative records, discussed in strategic planning, recorded in campaign reports. From the Mongol perspective, these were effective tactics worth preserving for future reference, rather than shameful secrets requiring concealment. The problem of erasure arose after Mongol power declined. Successor states that emerged from Mongol Empire fragments had complicated relationships with Mongol legacy. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, lasted only a century before being overthrown by the Ming dynasty. The Ming actively suppressed Mongol cultural influences and censored historical records that depicted Mongol practices too explicitly. They preserved enough to document conquest, but sanitized the most disturbing details. The Golden Horde in Russia gradually converted to Islam and integrated into Islamic cultural contexts that prohibited explicit discussion of sexual violence in historical texts. Russian chronicles from the period use euphemistic language that obscured the systematic nature of what occurred. Later, Russian historians, writing after Mongol rule ended, preferred narratives of Russian suffering, an eventual victory over narratives that detailed systematic protocols applied to Russian women. Islamic states that succeeded Mongol rule in Central Asia and the Middle East faced similar tensions. Persian historians who had worked for Mongol rulers and had access to administrative records wrote detailed accounts in the 13th century. But later, copyists and translators often removed or heavily edited the most explicit passages when reproducing these histories for new audiences. What survived was often sanitized compared to original texts. European historians who encountered accounts of Mongol conquests dismissed them as exaggerations from barbarous peoples. The assumption that civilized Europeans could not possibly learn anything useful from studying Asiatic conquerors led to neglect of sources that might have provided fuller understanding. When Europeans did pay attention to Mongol history, they focused on military tactics while ignoring or downplaying the systematic sexual violence. Modern academic history created additional layers of erasure through several mechanisms. The professionalization of history in the 19th and 20th centuries established norms about appropriate historical topics and language. Detailed discussion of systematic sexual violence fell outside these norms. Historians writing about Mongol conquests focused on battles, territorial expansion, and administrative systems while treating violence against women as tangential detail unworthy of serious analysis. The rise of Mongol nationalism in 20th century Mongolia created pressure to rehabilitate Genghis Khan as heroic founder of the Mongolian nation, rather than as conqueror whose armies implemented systematic protocols. Mongolian historians wrote accounts that emphasized military genius and governance innovations while minimizing or ignoring the treatment of conquered populations. Chinese historians dealing with Mongol legacy faced similar nationalist pressures. The Yuan dynasty was one of many foreign dynasties that ruled China. Modern Chinese nationalism required narratives of Chinese civilization maintaining continuity despite foreign conquest. Detailed examination of what happened to Chinese women during Mongol conquest conflicted with preferred narratives of cultural resilience. Feminist historians beginning in the late 20th century started challenging these erasures by insisting that systematic violence against women deserved serious historical analysis rather than dismissal as unfortunate side effect of warfare. Their work led to re-examination of primary sources and recognition that explicit details that had been dismissed as exaggerations were actually accurate descriptions of systematic practices. Recent decades have seen increased willingness to acknowledge historical sexual violence as strategic weapon rather than as incidental to military conflict. This shift in historical understanding has enabled more honest examination of Mongol protocols and their systematic nature. Contemporary historians using trauma-informed approaches to analyze primary sources recognize patterns that previous generations missed or ignored. The erasure was never complete because sources from too many different cultures survived. When Persian and Chinese and Russian and Arab chroniclers all describe the same practices independently, the historical reality becomes undeniable despite centuries of attempted concealment. Let us return now to the steppes outside Bukhara where our story began. Turkan Katun surrounded by Mongol warriors in the spring of 1220. 3 days have passed since the scene we witnessed at the opening. The claiming ritual is complete. She can barely move. The physical damage will heal partially over time, but will leave permanent changes to her body that affect her health for the rest of her life. She cannot speak without pain. Her voice is destroyed from screaming and from attempting not to scream. Her will is broken so completely that the concept of resistance no longer exists as possibility in her mind. Her sense of self, her identity as Sultan's wife and noblewoman, is erased beyond recovery. The woman who entered that circle no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The Mongol commander assigns her to a warrior named Jebe as property. She will travel with his household as the army continues westward into Persia and eventually into the Caucasus. She will survive the journey. She will perform labor. She will bear children, whose paternity is certain only in the sense that they are not her husband's children. She will exist in state of profound psychological absence, moving and breathing and performing functions but no longer present in any way that matters. She dies in 1232 at age 40, 12 years after Bukhara fell. The cause is listed in Mongol administrative records as illness, but the nature of the illness is not specified. Modern analysis of similar cases suggests chronic conditions resulting from long-term trauma and inadequate medical care. Her body simply gave up, no longer able to sustain life after years of carrying memories that made existence unbearable. The Mongol Empire, at its height, controlled 50 million square miles and 100 million people. That scale was achieved partly through military superiority, but significantly through systematic protocols designed to make resistance psychologically impossible. Turkan Katun was one woman among tens of thousands subjected to these protocols. Her suffering was replicated in cities across Asia and Eastern Europe. What happened to her was not exceptional. It was policy implemented with bureaucratic efficiency across the largest contiguous land empire in human history. What does this history reveal that matters beyond academic interest in medieval empires? About power, it reveals that empires control not just through military force, but through systematic trauma, designed to make resistance unthinkable. The most effective conquest does not merely defeat armies. It destroys the psychological capacity of populations to imagine resistance, to organize opposition, to maintain identity that exists independently of conquerors' control. The Mongols understood this at level most empires never achieved. About systematic violence, it reveals that the most devastating harm is often not chaotic but calculated, not spontaneous but designed, not isolated but implemented through bureaucratic systems with training and oversight and record-keeping. The horror lies not in loss of control, but in excessive control, not in passion, but in planning. When violence becomes administrative procedure, when trauma is inflicted through systems rather than by individuals, the scale of harm becomes limitless. About gender and power, it reveals that systematic sexual violence has long been recognized, though rarely admitted publicly, as extraordinarily effective strategic weapon. Violating women of conquered populations serves multiple imperial purposes simultaneously: destroying bloodline legitimacy, creating genetic mixing that prevents ethnic nationalism, generating survivors who spread deterrent accounts, demonstrating absolute power over the most protected members of enemy societies. These strategic functions explain why sexual violence appears so consistently across different empires and different time periods. It works. About historical memory, it reveals that societies systematically suppress knowledge of the most disturbing aspects of their pasts. The Mongol protocols were documented extensively in contemporary sources from multiple cultures, yet this history has been largely erased from popular understanding through centuries of sanitization and omission. The comfortable myth of history, as primarily military and political events, ignores systematic violence against women that was often more strategic than military campaigns themselves. About resilience and trauma, it reveals that human beings can survive extraordinary suffering, but survival is not the same as recovery. Women who lived through Mongol protocols physically survived for years or decades, but their psychological survival was often questionable. Contemporary sources describe them as fundamentally changed, existing in states of profound dissociation. Modern trauma psychology recognizes these descriptions as symptoms of severe, complex PTSD that would have been largely untreatable with resources available in medieval societies. Why this matters today is that these patterns have not disappeared, but have evolved. Systematic sexual violence as strategic weapon continues to appear in modern conflicts, from Bosnia to Rwanda to Syria. The techniques pioneered by the Mongols and refined by subsequent empires remain in use because they remain effective. Recognizing the historical patterns is essential for understanding contemporary conflicts and for developing more effective responses. The Mongol protocols also matter because their legacy lives in our genes. Millions of people today carry biological evidence of these systematic practices in their DNA. We are not discussing abstract, distant history, but events that literally shaped who exists in the present and what genetic characteristics they carry. For all the women who suffered and died under Mongol protocols across the vast expanse of empire from 1206 through 1400s. For Turkan Katun, age 28, wife of the Sultan, who died at 40 carrying trauma that made existence unbearable. For the 5,000 women of Samarkand, sorted and processed with bureaucratic efficiency, dispersed across the empire to destinations thousands of miles from their homes. For Princess Hojin Beki, age 32, who believed cooperation would protect her but learned that submission and resistance led to same destination. For Fatima of Herat, age 17 when captured, who survived to write testimony preserving details that official histories omitted. For the 700 women of Ryazan, allocated through lottery system to Mongol warriors as property equivalent to horses or weapons. For the 3,000 women of Merv, subjected to systematic processing that took 3 weeks to complete and destroyed the largest city in Central Asia. For the 30,000 noble women processed across Subutai's western campaign, documented in administrative records as logistical challenges resolved through efficient organization. For the women whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was documented only as numbers in administrative texts, whose individual stories are lost but whose collective fate is preserved in chronicles from a dozen cultures. For the survivors who lived for decades carrying memories they could not escape, existing in psychological states that contemporaries described as living death. For the children born from these violations, who carried genetic legacy of conquest, but who were themselves innocent of their father's actions. For the chroniclers who recorded these events, despite cultural prohibitions against explicit discussion, preserving evidence that enables modern understanding. For the populations whose genetic composition was permanently altered, carrying in their DNA evidence of systematic practices that destroyed ethnic continuity, they deserved better than what the Mongol Empire did to them. Their suffering was not divine will, but calculated policy. Their destruction was not collateral damage, but strategic objective. Their erasure from popular history was deliberate suppression rather than natural forgetting. Our remembering them matters because their experiences reveal truths about power and violence that societies prefer to forget, but that remain relevant to understanding both history and present. This is the history of conquest that empires documented in administrative records, but erased from popular memory. This is what systematic violence looks like when implemented at continental scale with bureaucratic efficiency. This is why we need to examine historical sources honestly, rather than sanitizing them for comfortable consumption. Subscribe to this channel if you want more hidden histories exposed. Comment below telling me which other conquests and empires you want examined with same unflinching honesty. Where in the world are you listening from? These stories matter because the patterns persist. These voices deserve to be heard because their experiences reveal truths about power that remain relevant today. And we are just beginning to uncover what empires tried to hide in administrative archives across 8 centuries.